Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.TV. Brian Lehrer recently celebrated his 25th anniversary as the host of the radio program The Brian Lehrer Show, originally called On the Line. It is one of the best and most popular public radio programs in the New York metropolitan area. Brian is also the host of BrianLehrer.TV right here on our City University channel. And he is here with us now to discuss his remarkable career and the ways in which New York and the United States have changed over the past quarter century. Brian, welcome. How are you?
Hey, Bob, and it's so great to be sitting across the table from you after you've been a guest on my show so many times, and I've had the chance to ask you questions about the issues and get your insights on so many occasions.
So now I get my chance. Role reversal. You know, you started your radio show during the early stages of a remarkable news cycle. It was in September, I believe, 1989. What were some of the things that were happening or about to happen right at that period?
Well, 6 weeks after we went on the air, the Berlin Wall had fallen, so we knew we must have been doing something right.
There you go.
And within days, I guess, of us going on the air, well, actually, I guess it happened just before we went on the air. There was a New York mayoral primary in which, historically, David Dinkins beat Ed Koch. Koch running for a fourth term, and of course we were to get our first black mayor, and only to date at that time making history that way. So the first thing, I walk in, you know, not having done this before in New York City, although I grew up here, and we have the collapse of communism and the first Dinkins-Giuliani race. Wow.
And I think people tend to forget how big a deal it was, Dinkins beating Koch in that Democratic primary. I mean, it was awesome. So let's talk about how the city, what the city was like then and how it's changed since then. Some of the things that immediately come to mind is that there was an awful lot of crime in the city then, upwards of 2,000 homicides a year. There were a series of racial controversies. There was a municipal scandal that started in the Parking Violations Bureau but spread to a lot of other high-ranking officials. What do you recall about what the city was like in the late 80s and early 90s?
Well, it's funny. I've been thinking through a 25-year frame a lot because we did a series of, you know, programs marking the anniversary, and thinking about what has changed locally and globally, what hasn't changed so much. So one of the things that I remember from the Dinkins-Koch race was that police treatment of minorities was an issue. And I recall it as being an even bigger issue in terms of who was voting in the Democratic primary than crime per se. And there were these incidents in the 1980s. Eleanor Bumpers killed by police officers when they came into her home after a police call, and some of the other names that were...
This was an elderly woman in the Bronx, emotionally disturbed, and police went into her apartment.
And she had a knife,
yep. But
they wound up shooting her, and excessive force became such a big issue in the city. Well, guess what? Look where we are today.
So some things haven't changed.
And, you know, so Dinkins came into office, and one of the things that he did was appoint a black police commissioner. Of course, there had been Ben Ward under Koch as well, but Dinkins police commissioner Lee Brown was seen as kind of a new generation, a new modern, you know, science-based police commissioner, but also from the community and hoping things could get better. I have a memory of you interviewing Lee Brown when your TV show was on WNYC television, when that station existed, and things were, you know, starting to change under Dinkins. And then, of course, he got pressured to do something more aggressively about crime.
One of my scoops at the Daily News, I was a reporter at the Daily News in those days, was an interview with Lee Brown when Lee Brown said, much to the mayor's chagrin, that he did not have enough police officers to do the job that was necessary, because crime really was pretty much out of control at that time. But Dinkins then moved ahead aggressively, and he had that Safe Streets, Safe Cities program, and that led to the hiring of 6,000 cops. And those additional police officers were used subsequently by Giuliani and subsequent mayors, and that did help bring the crime rate down. Dinkins does not get enough credit for that. But you mentioned how things have changed both nationally and globally too. Now, you don't just deal with local issues on your program. So talk a little bit about where the U.S. was in those days and how things have changed nationally. George H.W. Bush, I guess, was president. George H.W. Bush. Dan Quayle, vice president.
How about that? And, you know, I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking about is the first Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in the summer of 1990. And George H.W. Bush said, you know, he was drawing a line in the sand and the U.S. was going to go to war. And this was really our first serious military engagement at the end of the Cold War,
right,
when a lot of people thought a peace dividend was going to be breaking out, both at the level of tax money that could be spent on domestic programs instead of the military, and also just in terms of the U.S. not having to be on this war footing so much of the time. You know, looking back, I'm very critical of the first Iraq War. I think it has the reputation as the good Iraq War.
Right.
And then the George W. Bush Iraq War, you know, was so problematic. But people forget, and we covered it intensely at that time in late 1990, early 1991, as a debate, as something that was not a clear good. The Secretary of State at the time, James Baker, even admitted that this was a war to protect American lifestyle, which a lot of people took as, you know, overconsumption,
right,
based on the easy flow of oil. So why are we sending our military out to get all mixed up in the Middle East with all its complications to protect Kuwait, which was just, you know, the Times at the time called it an oil company with a flag. And so we got mixed up in Iraq, and we're still mixed up in Iraq and can't figure out how to extricate ourselves.
And there were a lot of Democratic elected officials, senators especially, who were opposed to that war.
It was a very close vote in the Senate.
And then it becomes, as you point out, then that became the good war, the war that we won, you know, erased the stain of Vietnam in a lot of people's minds. And then a number of Democrats felt that they had been embarrassed by their vote against that war, and then they felt the need to vote for the next Iraq war. It was one of the big changes has been, of course, the technological changes that have occurred over the past 25 years or so. And it struck me when I was doing a little background research for this program, you go immediately to Google. There was no Google in 1980, 89, and 90. There was no GPS. There were no smartphones or something. Was there a significant difference in the operational way that your program took place then compared to now?
Sure, there was a difference in the way that I did research. I used to go to the library. Remember the library? Of course,
I'm trying to recall.
Of course, libraries still provide such vital functions, including, you know, internet access for people who don't have it at home. Governor Cuomo was just talking in his State of the State address about the need to get broadband today into every poor person's home, rural and urban, in the state of New York. President Obama mentioned it in the State of the Union address as well. So libraries still play a vital role for that and for so many things. So not to, you know, down-talk library. But I used to
libraries were I'll never badmouth libraries either. They were crucial to me growing up and that sort of thing.
And they still
but
are.
The function of a library has really changed.
Right, for job training, for community services, for after school, informally, you know, libraries are vital. But for me at that time, I used to go to the library a fair number of days after work and, you know, look in the stacks of the old-time magazines, Newsweeks, and the microfilms of the New York Times and the Daily News and so forth, doing my research on stories that, you know, we were going to talk about in the news the next day. Obviously, I can do that, you know, on my phone now, and things have changed so much in that respect.
We talked about how things have changed locally, nationally, and that sort of thing, but yours is also a call-in program. What changes have you noticed in viewers, callers, changes in their concerns, and maybe even changes in the demographics themselves?
Well, people's concerns you know, again, thinking through a 25-year lens of what's changed and what hasn't changed. It's depressing sometimes to think about all the things that haven't changed.
Right.
You know, like the example I gave before. If Eleanor Bumpurs was a famous name for what happened to her, now obviously we have Eric Garner
Yep.
in the city and some of the others. So that kind of thing has not gone away, and people are as intensely divided and intensely passionate as they were about that. The U.S. role in the world, you would think after the Cold War, you know, the debate over American imperialism might have gone away, but it has remained in various ways. You know, after Iraq, after 9/11, think after 9/11, when so much of the world was so sympathetic to the United States as a victim at that moment, that we could have capitalized on that. But here we are having similar conversations that in a way we might have had in the 1960s or 70s or 80s about the U.S. as the dominant world power and whether we're treating the rest of the world properly. And President Obama is trying to grapple with that in a different way than his predecessors. But one of the things that's changed tremendously, and I know you know this, is the acceptance of gays and lesbians. The whole LGBT movement has been so successful. And you know how I hear it? If we were going to do, when we did gay segments, gay-oriented segments, there would be this undercurrent of hate calls that would come in. There would always be a certain percentage of hate calls on the line, or I'd get mail afterwards, even before there was email. If we were doing a segment on AIDS when it was relatively new, it would produce anti-gay hate messages. It doesn't happen very much anymore. That's not to say that there isn't, you know, homophobia and hateful attacks, even physical attacks and things like that that go on. But the population has really changed. I still get it with respect to race. Even on Martin Luther King Day, just this year, you know, just the other day, really, there are always callers on the board who want to say, oh, affirmative action meant I couldn't go to college, or Martin Luther King was a this or a that. So, you know, it seems to me that that homophobia is on the wane more than racism.
I agree with that. I still get the racist mail and the racist calls and that sort of thing. But on the on gay issues, it's just been a sea change. And I tell people, you know, I grew up in New Jersey back in the 50s and 60s and went to parochial school. It was not even an issue you could address. It wasn't something that even people were willing to acknowledge existed. And that has completely changed. You mentioned 9/11. Now, that obviously was the biggest, by far, news story of your tenure. For someone who's doing a daily program with call-ins, right at the very beginning, how did you guys deal with that? How did you address that terrible tragedy, which for us was local?
Absolutely. And I was in shock, along with everybody else. WNYC studios at that time were in the municipal building 6 blocks from the World Trade Center. I was in my office and heard the planes crash into the buildings. My producer, who was in an office with a view of the World Trade Center, saw the second plane come into the building. So this was very personal for us. And we were evacuated to the NPR studios in Midtown. So we walked through that period of time, 10 a.m. to noon, that would normally have been my show, because they were getting as many people out of the building as they possibly could. Our morning news host, Mark Hyland, was very brave in staying on the air until my crew and I could relocate uptown, as the rest of the whole station was relocating uptown, realizing that we were going to be there for a while, that we were going to have to be out of the area for a while. Our reporters, and of course, you know, working at the Times, I guess you were at that time.
Yeah, it was at the Times then, yeah.
You had the same experience with colleagues, and some of the reporters at WNYC, while everybody else was running away from the World Trade Center, they were running toward it to report. So, you know, unbelievable. But we went uptown. I finally got on the air that day at 5:30 in the afternoon. That's how long it took to set everything up. And then for days and weeks afterwards, part of the show was just the therapy session
Right.
of opening up the phones and letting people say whatever they wanted, and whether that had to do with personal losses or whether that had to do with political rants about the root causes or the evil of the attackers.
Right.
You know, some of it was just to not be too directive in telling people what they should be talking about with respect to it.
Now, you mentioned in the early days going to the library to do research and background and that sort of thing. It strikes me that for the kind of programs that you do, being prepared is like so essential, and yet it's a daily show. How do you go about being prepared on these sometimes, frequently very complex issues every day?
Well, homework is my life. There's no question about that. A lot of homework, but you find your shortcuts, and I have a great team. I have 5 producers, and we work together every day before the show and after the show to figure out what we're going to do that day, what we're going to do in the subsequent days, and we divide up the reading and writing that we're going to do for the short-term coverage, whatever's in the headlines that we deem most important is going to lead the show the next day. But then later in the show, we're doing longer-term things. So we can plan and do things bit by bit. Certainly we react to the news, but we divvy it up. We also read different things, you know. Informally, we know that between the various of us on the team, we should be looking at a variety of different kinds of media. And I'll tell you, Bob, that's one of the biggest things that's changed over the years. It used to be that I could get up in the morning, basically look at the 4 daily newspapers, and I was read in. And on, you know, then I would also look at the weeklies when they would come out once a week, and I would have a rotation. Now, of course, there are so many websites and blogs and social media platforms. Sometimes Twitter is my front page.
Isn't that something?
Because of the people we follow, the journalists and news organizations that we follow. What's most interesting from most of the major media that day will tend to rise to the top of what people are tweeting about, and I'll see not only what the news is, but what the buzz about the news is.
If someone had said to you in 1989, you know, Google or tweeting, I mean, you were like, what are they talking about? You know,
Right.
that would have something to do with your profession.
It's also been great for us, though, because the nature of the show from the beginning was interactive as a call-in show. And so as these new modes of interactivity have come into play, it's meant worlds of new opportunity for us to involve different audiences in the public square kind of forum that we try to provide. You know, there are different people who post to us via Facebook than who are on Twitter, than who call in. You know, I'll give you an example. 2008, during the height of the Obama versus Hillary Clinton primary season, it was really before Facebook and Twitter got that big, though they existed. So our big 2 platforms were the call-ins and the comments page on our website. And our callers were much more pro-Hillary, and our web posters were much more pro-Obama.
That is so funny.
Because it was a younger audience.
And that's what played out in the election.
That's right.
Technology was like so important to the Obama administration. They had mastered it in a way that the Clinton forces had not.
That's right. And so we see that, you know, still to this day. Twitter is a more politicized environment than Facebook. Facebook comments tend to be more generally positive, more descriptive about things. People are, there's a little more lightness of being on Facebook and Twitter. And I love Twitter. I tweet. You know, we have tens of thousands of followers. It's a good place for various kinds of public discussion to take place, but it's going to be a little bit more combative, and Facebook is going to be more descriptive with more lightness of being.
We talked about September 11th, which was an unbelievable tragedy, but were there other programs or subjects that just stand out as highlights over the course, I mean major highlights over the course of your career?
Well, you know, I guess in a way the big 3 posts, if I had to name big three posts, I don't know. No, three is too. You can't name. How can you name three things in 25 years? But that Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait, that really set up U.S. foreign policy for years, and that was, that was an earthquake at that time. Then obviously 9/11, and the other huge thing in New York, Sandy.
Oh yeah.
And the financial crisis.
Yep.
People say September 11th. We know what we mean just by saying the calendar date. I also say September 15th, because September 15th, 2008 was the day that Lehman Brothers went down.
Yep.
And that really plunged us.
It
was bubbling up, but that really plunged us into the financial crisis.
We're recovering, but we still haven't recovered,
right.
From that.
Right, and other things were chronic, like the decline in crime that we mentioned before. Such a huge change in what it means to be in New York, but it was a gradual drip, drip, drip kind of thing in the right direction. The huge events for me were the first Gulf War, the 9/11 attacks,
yeah.
Obviously, financial crisis, and Sandy.
Was there a proudest moment?
Oh, I don't know. Probably not. I think, I'm proud of the fact that I'm focused on tomorrow's show. You know what I mean? That there's a process. Doing a daily show where you're trying to digest a lot of local and national and international means staying focused. And so I guess I have a pride in the day-to-dayness. Like the baseball players, they go out and they play every day. It's not like the NFL where they go and, gear up for the one big show every Sunday. Try to stay in it and stay focused and look at the big picture even as you're looking at the small picture.
What happens when you're in the early stages of a program and it's just not going well? It's like, whatever it is, whether it's the topic, whether it's the guest, the callers, it's not working. What do you do? How do you handle that?
You gotta shake it off. I hate to use another sports analogy, but if you make an error early in the game, and you're in the field in a baseball game, don't take it to your at-bat.
Right.
Or you're going to mess yourself up for the rest of the day.
You got to have a short memory.
And you got to have a short memory and just move on. You have to be willing to, if a guest is horrible, you have to be willing to cut that segment shorter.
Right.
And even just, ad lib and open phones. Good call-in question to fill some time. That's happened a few times. But also, you have to adjust. If a guest is not responding to the questions that I ask to start out, and maybe something's not clicking and not connecting, then I have to ask myself, how can I adjust? Rather than just say, this is a bad guest. How can I get the most out of this person? What is this person interested in? What is this person going to be passionate and articulate about? And try to feel for that.
We've got less than a minute left, but I really want to ask, how did you get into this business? Had you always wanted to be a radio host, or how did it happen?
Believe it or not, I did. When I was a teenager and my friends were listening to Hits Radio,
right.
I was listening to Hits Radio in New York, the old WABC and stuff like that.
I remember it well.
But I was also, for whatever reason, drawn to going up and down the dial and listening to talk shows,
classical music on the radio.
Classical music on the radio, but a lot of talk, actually. Gene Shepard telling his old
yeah.
stories on WOR, Steve Post in the middle of the night on WBAI, and there was something really magical about that for me. So I started out as a DJ because I was also into music, but realized that I was more interested in the news, and I wanted to talk. And I went back for a master's in journalism and made that transition.
We have all benefited from you making the right choice. Brian Lehrer, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Great to be with you, Bob.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. An apartment on Manhattan's West 57th Street has reportedly sold for more than $100 million. This astonishingly expensive 11,000 square foot penthouse takes up the building's 89th and 90th floors, has 6 bedrooms and 7 bathrooms, every luxury convenience you can imagine, and many that you can't imagine, along with views resembling those that you would see from a mountaintop. At the same time that our real estate barons are finding buyers for such glittering royal palaces, the city is struggling to house more than 60,000 homeless people in its shelters every night. More than 25,000 of those who are crammed into these dismal municipal sanctuaries are children, and still there aren't enough shelters for everyone who needs them. Tons of people are turned away each night. So let's see. On the one hand, $100 million palaces in the sky. On the other, scores of thousands of homeless people desperately seeking shelter on the ground. What's wrong with this picture? That's all for now. See you next time.